The Last Turtle, Zero, Zen, and the Culmination of Faith by Jim Reddell. Chapter 3. General Authority. Faith in the Historical. If faith is not belief, but an activity, specifically, the assigning of authority in the face of uncertainty, then the question immediately becomes, to whom or to what is that authority first assigned? For most, the answer is not themselves. It is not even someone they know. It is, instead, something inherited, something already established, something that appears to have endured. It is the historical. This chapter examines the earliest and most common manifestation of faith, the assigning of authority to tradition, scripture, and historical figures. This is what we might call general authority, a broad, often unquestioned reliance on what has come before. It is the default setting of faith, the starting point of nearly every spiritual path, and, importantly, a necessary stage in the development of faith as an activity. But necessary does not mean sufficient. To understand why, we must look carefully at how general authority arises, what sustains it, and where it inevitably begins to break down. Recall the structure introduced earlier. Faith arises as an activity when certain conditions converge, what we know as zero faith. These are not causes in the linear sense, but necessary conditions. When these conditions are present, a disturbance, a moment of incongruity, can trigger the manifestation of faith. In the case of general authority, there are three fundamental conditions that give rise to the faith activity, which are remarkably consistent across cultures and time. First, a lack of direct knowledge or certainty. Next, the belief that the solution lies with historical authorities. And last, a mechanism to engage the necessary authority. These conditions create a landscape in which faith is not just possible, but inevitable. And when uncertainty takes center stage, questions about life, death, purpose, suffering, the individual typically does not invent a solution. Instead, they look outward. They look backward. They turn to what has already been said, already written, already believed. And in that turning, faith manifests as the assigning of authority to the historical. Tradition is powerful precisely because it does not present itself as a choice. It presents itself as a given. One does not typically decide to trust tradition in the same way one decides between two competing options. Rather, tradition is absorbed through family, culture, education, long before the individual has the capability to critically evaluate it. This is the first subtlety of general authority. It often precedes a conscious faith. A child raised within a religious tradition does not initially experience their relationship to that tradition as an act of assigning authority. It simply is authoritative. The rituals, the stories, the moral structures, these are not questioned because they are not yet seen as optional. Only later, when uncertainty arises in a more nuanced form, does the individual begin to actively rely on that inherited authority. At that moment, what was once implicit becomes explicit. Faith, as a conscious activity, begins. And what does it look like? It looks like statements such as, "This must be true, because it has always been taught." So many people believe this. It cannot be wrong. This tradition has lasted for centuries. It must contain truth. Notice what is happening here. The authority is not derived from direct experience, but from continuity, from endurance, from the sheer weight of historical persistence. This is the logic of general authority. What has survived must be valid. It is not an irrational position. But it is not the final one either. If tradition is the broad transmission of authority, Scripture is its crystallization. Scriptures function as fixed points within the flow of tradition. They are treated as authoritative not only because of their content, but because of their perceived origin, often attributed to divine revelation, enlightened insight, or uniquely qualified individuals. In this sense, Scripture represents a refinement of general authority. It narrows the field. Instead of relying on a diffuse historical continuity, it anchors authority in specific texts. But the underlying activity remains the same. Authority is assigned in response to uncertainty. When confronted with questions that cannot be answered through immediate experience, questions about ultimate reality, moral truth, or the nature of suffering, the individual turns to Scripture as a source of resolution. The process unfolds almost automatically. An uncertainty presents itself. The individual recalls or seeks out a relevant teaching. Authority is assigned to that teaching. The uncertainty is temporarily resolved. This resolution, however, is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is its containment. Scripture does not remove the unknown. It provides a framework within which the unknown can be tolerated. And this is both its strength and its limitation. Beyond tradition and Scripture, there is a third dimension of general authority: the reliance on historical figures. These figures, prophets, sages, teachers, serve as embodiments of the authority that tradition and Scripture attempt to convey. They are not just sources of teaching. They are role models of realization. To assign authority to a historical figure is to say, in effect, this person saw something clearly. It seems compelling. Therefore, I will trust their vision. Again, this is not inherently problematic. In fact, it is often necessary. Without such figures, any path would lack direction. There would be no indication that the desired state, the far shore, is attainable. But notice the structure. An uncertainty presents itself. A historical figure is recognized as possessing the answer. Authority is assigned to that figure. The individual aligns their understanding and behavior accordingly. This is faith in its historical form. And it is deeply compelling because it offers something more than abstract teaching. It offers the possibility of transformation. If this person achieved clarity, perhaps I can as well. At this point, general authority appears robust. It is supported by tradition, reinforced by scripture, and embodied by historical figures. It provides answers, structure, and a sense of continuity. But beneath this stability lies a subtle fragility. Because the authority is external, it is borrowed, it is distant. And as long as it remains distant, it is vulnerable to confusion. What kinds of confusions? Encountering conflicting traditions or scriptures. Recognizing inconsistencies within a given tradition. Experiencing a gap between teaching and lived reality. When such confusions arise, the previously stable assigning of authority begins to waver. Consider the individual who encounters multiple religious traditions, each claiming authority. The logic of "this has always been taught" becomes insufficient when confronted with competing always. Or consider the individual who studies a scripture closely and begins to notice contradictions, ambiguities, or historical contingencies. The sense of fixed authority begins to erode. Or perhaps most significantly, consider the individual who practices diligently, follows the teachings, and yet finds that their direct experience does not align with what has been promised. In each case, the confusion is not merely intellectual. It is existential, and it triggers a new activity. Returning to Sasaki's teachings on zero, we can say that the activity of faith, once arisen, manifests as naturally opposing activities. These opposing activities might be described as affirmation and questioning. Affirmation, reinforcing the assigned authority. Questioning, challenging or re-evaluating that authority. These movements are not separate choices. They arise together as part of the same faith activity. The more one affirms, the more subtle questions may arise. The more one questions, the more one may seek reassurance in affirmation. This oscillation is not a failure of faith. It is its natural unfolding. But it does reveal something important. General authority cannot remain static. It either deepens or destabilizes. There is either expansion or contraction. And in either case, it moves. Doubt is often treated as the enemy of faith. But within this framework, doubt is better understood as the contraction activity that allows faith to inevitably manifest in new forms. Without doubt, there is no need to reassign authority. Without reassigning, there is no development. At the general authority stage, doubt plays a critical role. It exposes the limitations of inherited frameworks. It reveals the difference between borrowed certainty and direct understanding. But here is the tension. Too little doubt, and faith remains superficial, unexamined, rigid, and ultimately fragile. While too much doubt, and faith collapses entirely, leaving the individual unmoored. The path forward is not the elimination of doubt, but its integration. Doubt must be allowed to do its work, to destabilize what is merely inherited, while not discounting the benefits of faith altogether. This is a delicate balance. And it is precisely what propels the individual beyond general authority. At some point, for those who continue along a serious path, general authority becomes insufficient. Not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. The individual begins to recognize that tradition can guide, but not guarantee understanding. Scripture can point, but not substitute for direct experience. Historical figures can inspire, but not transfer realization. This recognition is not a rejection of the historical. It is a recontextualization. Authority is no longer assigned because something is historical. Instead, the historical becomes a reference point. Valuable, but not ultimate. And this shift marks the transition to a more specific form of authority. What then is the product? The outcome of this stage of faith. Several outcomes are possible. Stability. A coherent worldview supported by tradition and scripture. Orientation. A sense of direction provided by historical examples. Community. Participation in a shared framework of belief and practice. Tension. The emergence of doubt and questioning. These outcomes are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often coexist. But from a development perspective, the most important outcome is tension. Because tension drives movement. Without tension, the individual remains within general authority indefinitely. Secure, perhaps, but limited. With tension, the possibility of transformation emerges. We can now see general authority for what it is. Not the end point of faith, but its threshold. It is the stage at which faith first becomes visible as an activity, The stage at which authority is assigned not by default, but by choice. It is also the stage at which the limitations of external authority begin to reveal themselves. And this revelation is not a failure. It is an invitation. An invitation to move from the general to the specific, from the historical to the immediate, from borrowed authority to something more direct. It would be a mistake to dismiss general authority as naive or inferior. Without it, there would be no entry point into the path at all. Tradition, scripture, and historical figures provide the structure within which initial instances of faith can arise. They offer a language, a set of symbols, a direction of travel. They make the path visible, but they do not complete it. And to mistake the beginning for the end is to remain indefinitely on the near shore, studying maps, recounting the journeys of others, but never quite crossing. If general authority is faith in the historical, the next stage will involve a narrowing of that authority. No longer spread across tradition as a whole, authority becomes concentrated in specific individuals, teachers, guides, living representatives of the path. This shift introduces new dynamics: proximity, accountability, and direct interaction. It also introduces new risks. Because the closer the authority comes, the more consequential its assigning becomes. And so the question evolves. Not just what has been taught, but who, specifically, do I trust? That question will define the next stage of faith. And it will demand a more precise, more active, and ultimately more personal assigning of authority.